Okay. Great. So I want to kind of follow up with talking about some other kind of features of React that are just important to know, and from there kind of get into just kind of reiterating some of the main points of what React is important, like just the important kind of key elements of React, and just kind of touch on a feature that's really important to know that exists, and in relationship to some of the stuff we've been talking about. So last few sessions, we've been going through these docs and like the main kind of concepts. And like I told y'all at the beginning, following these main concepts on the docs is a good way to get very well acclimated with the key aspects of React that are important to understand. Everything from understanding JSX, creating these elements and rendering them on the screen, to creating your own custom components that render your own elements, and passing data between them with props and state, and handling events, conditional rendering, right? All these really big important milestones that we've gotten to with regards to how we've been leveraging React, but also just in general, everything kind of builds up on there. And I think last time when I did first talk about the React router, I talked about the way in which the router itself was kind of an example of how conditional rendering and handling props and state and stuff like that kind of gets expanded into these more complicated facets and stuff like that. A lot of what we've been talking about utilize these last few things: list keys, forms, passing state around, and just kind of overall thinking in React. So congrats if you stuck with me so far. You probably are pretty familiar with these main concepts, and whether or not you feel hella confident is up to the amount of time we're spending doing projects and getting more familiar with how these things work in a practical sense. But those are really it as it relates to main concepts. There's not any more fundamental things that you need to know in order to become a great React developer. Focusing on these areas will get you all the skills you need in order to build web pages of your own that leverage the React framework and library to do the things that you want to do on your front end. And yeah, it's a great milestone to accomplish. There are, like in every language or framework or whatnot, more and more kind of advanced and intermediate things to look into. And so, the advanced guides of this documentation is important to know, but a lot of the stuff in here is stuff that isn't as necessary to touch until you get a good grasp of the main concepts. So just wanted to make that point here with this particular area. But there is a couple sections on working with React that are important, and as it is important, they gave them their own sections, but they are a little bit further down in the React docs. So it's kind of maybe not the first thing that people might think to take a look at. And so the first one is this idea of React hooks. And just kind of show of thumbs, to show of hands or whatnot, how many of y'all have seen or heard of React hooks before? Just kind of want to get a pulse check there. Okay, cool. So yeah, a couple folks. Great. So yeah, no problem if you haven't seen it yet. Matter of fact, I didn't really introduce it, OD, because I feel like learning about components through classes is really a good way to then understand some of what the hooks are doing and get a better introduction to them in general. So just in this kind of moment, I wanted to touch on some of what like React hooks does and why it's important to know about it. So hooks are a new addition in React. They're not something that was there at the onset, and that's why you don't really see everyone using it. It's still something that is kind of a newer feature that people are getting used to, and more people are converting to. But at the same time, it's still very much the case that you can do most of what you would do with a hook in a regular class-based component. The idea of a hook was created to allow you to use state and other features from React without writing a class. So, you know, a lot of what we talked about these last few weeks have been me telling you like, oh, if you want to use state, you have to create a class-based component, you have to use a constructor and write state and all of these things, which for a long time in the React ecosystem was true. That was the only way you could do that. But when they started creating hooks was because people wanted to have the convenience of writing a functional component because it's quick, small, short, not too much code that you have to write, right? But I want my functional component to also have state, right? So people wanted the best of both worlds, and some folks from the React team decided to prioritize that as a feature, and they gave us hooks. And so hooks are a very important kind of addition to your arsenal as a React developer. Writing functional components, writing class-based components, you're going to have to make the decisions on what makes sense for your project or what makes sense for the code and code cleanliness. But now that you are getting introduced to this, now you can use the functional components that you're familiar with writing and add state and props and all of those other aspects without having to turn your whole component into a class. So here's an example of a component that is using a hook. So functional components. So remember, you can only use hooks inside of functional components. And that is the biggest difference. You can't use a hook inside of a class-based component. If you're writing a class-based component, you can just use the regular class-based lifecycle methods to achieve the same things as what these hooks are doing. And so here's an example of an example component. That component is really just doing some text-based stuff. It has a paragraph that says you clicked a blank amount of times. It has a button, and you can click on the button. So let's just actually bring this in to our little class-based, our little component here. And so what I'm gonna do is, I don't need this login anymore. I'm going to change some stuff up real quick. Cool. So save this real fast, and let me actually do this way. Because they made so inside of that example, they had named the component example. So I'm just gonna make a component called example so we can actually see it built out that way. All right, but so same kind of setup, got this here. And then in the app.js, I don't need to do much of this navigation stuff anymore. So I'm gonna just get rid of that for now and just rewrite the I'm gonna just rewrite the app component, and let's just have the app component import the example component, example from just return div with the example component. Oh, my fault. All right, cool. So this little app is pretty simple. I'll zoom in a little bit. It says you click blank times and it gives you a button that you can click. So clearly I can click this button and this number here at the top is changing. And so just thinking about an app like this is fairly simple, especially if you think about how we would do this, right? This is a simple component. Without looking at the code, OD, we can just say, imagine a component that has some text and this maybe number is a variable that's changing over time due to some action inside of the component. As this button is changing, this number is changing. That probably is a component that is utilizing state, right? So at this point, you might be able to envision how you might build this as a class-based component, right? You'd build a component, create a constructor, add a state to the top. Inside of the state, you might have like number or clicks or something as your state, or count as your state or something like this.state.count. And that's what would be returned here. Like you'd have some text, and inside of the text, you'd say something like this.state.count. And, you know, you'd have a render function with that phrase and then the button, right? So that's how we would do that with a class-based component. But a functional component keeps things a little bit simple, but also using hooks, we can get the best of both of those worlds. So we can keep the simplicity of the functional component, which here's the simple kind of code for the functional component. Like I said before, here's the paragraph that says you clicked, and then they have a JavaScript variable being an object that holds a variable passed here, so it can get rendered. Remember, in React, you can render JavaScript elements, objects, data, functions, etc. Just by putting a curly brace and then passing the JavaScript object, data, or function or whatnot into your code, into the render function of your, into the actual JSX. This button, typical, like most buttons do, have an on-click handler, and they're passing the function here. And cool, so we see this variable called count, and then we see this function called set count. And it's the set count is clearly taking whatever the count was, adding 1 to it. And that's what the button is responsible for. So let's talk a little bit about this structure and how this is using a hook. So hooks are basically little bits of like functional code that come back from the React library. There's a number of different hooks. So we're going to talk about 2 of the important ones. The first is the use state hook. And this hook is utilized to use state. Simple as that. It is a hook that lets you create a state variable. Note that I say variable singular, that is tied to some variable that you can reference and given a specific function that allows you to update that particular variable that you've created. So when you create state in a class, you can create as many different variables as you want in the state. And then you have one function that can update any of them, right? You have the this.set state. In a hook, in a function, you can only set hooks to be connected to state one at a time. So you have one variable name paired with its accompanying set state kind of function, right? It's each variable has its own kind of set state function, which, you know, you might argue that is a little bit more complicated than using a class. I wouldn't disagree with you. Everyone has a personal preference as to whether they want to use hooks or whether they want to use classes, especially based on how many state variables or however many hooks you might need to get your code running the way that you would expect it. But as you can see, the format for using a hook, you import the hook, the name of the hook, particularly from the React library. Here in this import, we see a shortcut syntax where you can import multiple things from one library by using commas. So we're importing the main React we're importing the main React module from the React library, but inside of there's also all types of stuff can get returned from the React library. So we use this curly brace syntax to basically specify the particular modules from within the library we want to take. So in this case, one of the ones I want is the use state hook. So curly braces to say a specific module I want to get back, and then use state. So from the React library. Then the use state function that comes back, or the use state hook, I should say, that comes back is giving us the ability to create a set of objects off of this function that is ran here. So the use state syntax is a little interesting. You create a variable and then you use this array to structure what would be called your variable name, and then the corresponding, and this is for the state, the use state hook. The syntax is you create a variable that you create like kind of this variable array that has a defined object that will be what is your data that is going to be holding, like the state data. Like, so in this case, the data that we're trying to keep track of is the count, and then a corresponding function name for updating this variable. So in most cases, you see the syntax being whatever you name this, you name the accompanying function set that thing. So that's just kind of best practice for hooks in general, is the name of whatever you set it to, the name of whatever the data is, and then the corresponding function would be set that thing. And then you set that equal to the use state function, and then you have to pass the initial state value of this particular data point. So this whole thing is basically saying, create a hook that has count and set count defined. Count is going to start out at 0. That's what this syntax represents. So if I wanted to create another hook, another state hook, right? I wanted something else to use state, but I didn't want to make this a class. I wanted to use it as a function. I'd have to create a different hook for that other thing that I want to keep track of. So maybe I want to keep track of visits on the page. How many times have I visited the page? And so I might set it up like this, right? And just like before, right? Visits is going to be the thing I can reference. Set visits would be the function I would call to update this, but I'm going to start it out at 1, right? That's how you would create another hook. This could be numbers, it could be Booleans, you know what I'm saying? Like, it could be whatever kind of data that you want. So here's an example of this being Booleans, right? It could be a string, right? So if you were doing a form and you wanted to use hooks instead of using a class-based component, you could do that. You could do that with hooks, like so, right? So in all of these cases, you just got to remember that the use state is going to set whatever this is whatever the default data inside of this will be. And yeah, that's how the use state hook works. So clearly in this example of the count and set count, count is the name of the data, and then set count is the corresponding function that is updating that data. So in this case, we have count, and just because we have it defined here, we can make use of it inside of the function in different places that are using JSX. So here we pass the count to be returned in this message, and then we use the set count function inside of the button on click function, right? And the set count function takes that count and then adds 1 to it to increment the state that way. And so this is how the use state hook works. It's a pretty important hook. One of the 2 important ones that is allowing you to create state variables from within your functional components. A pretty important kind of aspect. So some things to just note about hooks. There's no plans for them to remove classes from React. So if you don't really like this idea of using hooks, that's cool. You could just write classes and nobody's going to judge you off of it because it's still accepted to use classes for things that normally you would want to use state or like use these other methods for. Hooks were just built literally to make it so that you could create functional components that are doing a little bit more smarter, working a little bit more smarter. Yeah, hooks don't replace your knowledge of React concepts, which is why they don't talk about hooks in the main concepts, right? It's important to understand that hooks just give you a more direct API to use those concepts from within a functional component. So prop, state, context, we didn't really talk about context refs, but all of the main concepts that are important for React are able to still be utilized without hooks. These are just a different way to like use and combine them. And yeah, so they talk a lot about like why they built the hooks, and you can read and learn more about why they find it effective. And then like here it talks a little bit more about how the classes kind of gets confusing, and understanding the this keyword and all the stuff that probably y'all were like, yo, like this is true. I did struggle with this, but hooks, in an attempt to make things a little bit easier to understand, can also make things a little bit more complicated. So that's why it's important to know both things exist, and to learn both to leverage in your own capacities. The other reason I'm telling you about hooks now versus before is because certain packages start to use hooks versus class-based components, and then expect you to use the hook version of a code piece versus a giving you a class-based method that you could call. So that means that you would have to make sure your component was a functional component, and so you could use that particular hook that was defined in the particular package. And I know that the React Router library has some stuff that is structured like that. But yeah, just so that y'all keep that in mind. So lot to talk about with hooks. I would recommend that y'all read through this, the hooks intro section of the React documentation on your own time, to just get an introduction to it and why they started it and whatnot. We just talked about the use and state hook, which is just a simple hook that lets you create a new state variable and a corresponding update function to or setter function that you can default that value to something, and then use that function to update and set the data for this particular variable programmatically inside of your code base. And here's an example of the same thing, but written out as a class. So you can see code is not that much longer, right? In a class, it's just a little bit more structured in terms of how the class is defined, how you create a constructor. But you can do the same thing just within class using a hook. So in some cases, it saves you time, makes things look a little bit more easy to read and understand, but other times it's not too much of a trade-off. So, you got to really weigh in like when you want to use which one. And yeah. So yeah, just remember that you can only use hooks and functional components, and that it won't work if you were trying to add a hook to a class-based component. So the use state hook is pretty important because we normally use state all the time in React, right? So if you wanted to use state, it is important to use this hook to do that, and you can update and all types of stuff there. So that's the use state hook and how it works in general. It talks a little bit here about this syntax. This syntax is called array destructuring, which basically allows you to create variables off of an array, off of like data that's inside of an array. So the use state hook returns an array, and it here you're taking data from that array, off of that array, to use independently. So the name of this set fruit become like variables of their own that you can use. The destructuring syntax, where did it talk about destructuring? Yeah. So array destructuring and object destructuring is a syntax thing of JavaScript that lets you take data from an array or take data from an object pretty easily, just with this kind of format here. Cool. So that's the use state hook. It's a very important hook to know. Not too crazy to mess around with, but still important nonetheless. The next hook that I wanted to present is the second big hook that's important in React. It's the use effect hook. This hook is a very interesting hook because it does a lot from one function. And for that, it can get pretty confusing to understand how it works and when to use it, etc. But the use effect hook lets you perform side effects in function components. So trying to give a good example of, so certain times things update inside of a component and you want the component to render those new changes. In a class-based component, it's almost, the way that classes are structured, that re-rendering and updating process is kind of already automated through like the lifecycle methods that are come with classes. But within the hook base and functional components, if you want something to update after something has taken place, you need to use the use effect hook to trigger that update, basically. So we will see. Let's just use this use state use effect hook example and kind of talk through how it's working. So go back to this code. Cool. So slightly different example. Here you see the title up here in the tab is set to the same thing here. But as I click on this, the title updates also with regards to the clicks. So prior to that, right, I didn't have something like that changing. But now I can make something like that change because of the using the use effect hook. So first I want to show like, let's just take away the use effect hook and kind of set this document title thing on its own and kind of just see what happens. So click 0 times. Wait 1 second. Bro, the use effect hook, I ain't even gonna hold y'all, is one of the most confusing ones. Because it essentially, the use effect hook should be called when you want to update something over time. But clearly here, if we didn't use the use effect hook in this example, it still works. Like this is still updating. So kind of doesn't really show, this kind of isn't really showing the entire kind of process of how this would work in general. But I wanna give a good example, but I also don't want to take too much time. So maybe I'll do that in another class, in another video, or just in another example. But the use effect hook is a hook that is useful for making updates to a code base after certain things have changed. So this example of kind of just changing it based on the count isn't actually showing it off as best as it can, but it still is kind of showing this idea that you can update the title. Maybe they actually have another example later in the code. So here's an example of what they would be doing in a class-based component. In the class-based component, you set the state at 0, right? Like we saw before, and you create the state, state.count, and the button is incrementing the state basically. Then if you wanted to update, something in the bigger kind of application, there's two lifecycle methods that are defined for you to do that within a component, within a class-based component. It's the component did mount lifecycle method and the component did update lifecycle method. So just as a kind of recap to these lifecycle methods, because I'm sure we might not have remembered them. Every React component goes through specific life cycles of being created. So there's three stages for every component. There's a stage of mounting, the stage of updating, and the stage of unmounting. Inside of the mounting stage, this is the stage that happens. When a component is being created. Updating is when a component that already is created is getting updated, and then unmounting is when a component isn't going to be shown anymore, and so it's going to be taken away from the DOM, and so unmounting happens later. The components that are mounting, in that mounting phase, that's when the constructor gets called. And then once the component finishes mounting, so during the mounting phase, the constructor gets called, the render method gets called, and then finally, the component did mount lifecycle method gets called. And then that component is just on the screen. Then when a component is being updated, so say like you change the state, or like the state is changing something that's supposed to be on that component, the component is going to receive new props. The set state function might get called, or a force update function might get called, that then triggers a function called the component should update, and then that will re-render the component. The re-render of the component then triggers this function component did update to get called. And then in the unmounting stage, when the component is getting ready to get taken off of the hierarchy, component will unmount just gets called right before it gets taken away. So lifecycle methods are built into class-based components. You can we created the render function before we created constructor. The component did mount and component did update are functions that we can define and then write some code to call when this function gets triggered. So that's why the lifecycle methods were really important, was because you can leverage those lifecycle methods in order to call to change things about the date, change aspects of the component at certain times of the lifecycle. So, and a good example of where like these lifecycle methods come in, and like I said, I won't talk about it too much now, but we'll probably talk about it in a session or two from now, is like API handling. So if I were going to an external source that had information and we're talking to a server or something, talking to the server takes some time. So I would want to wait till that information comes back and the component's in a good place to re-update itself with that information to pass that stuff. And so typically we use the component did mount function and to trigger some of that logic out. So asynchronous based things are normally good in that sense. So in this example of the hook, basically this hook, so like I was just saying, data fetching, setting up things, manually changing the DOM are side effects. They're kind of they're things that happen after something else has happened. And the use effect hook is the hook that you can use in a functional component to trigger those methods to get called at the moments in which the component is having those changes be made. So the use effect hook takes away this use effect hook gets called in all of the moments that component did mount, component did update, and component will unmount get called combined. So that's what makes it a little confusing. Is in a class, it's very clear what stages these functions get called, and these functions are isolated. So you'll never mess up component did update with code from component did mount. With the use effect hook, all three of these green methods are stacked into one hook. So it kind of gets a little confusing as to when that particular thing is getting called, but that is the hook that is given to you in order to use. And so the other thing that makes the use effect hook a little confusing is this idea of effects with cleanup and without cleanup. So sometimes you might want to run additional code after your React component has updated the DOM. So they're saying that like typical kind of operations like talking to a server or hitting a network request or manual DOM changes like this change that we see with the title in our example and just logging. So like printing something are effects that don't require cleanup. You can run them and immediately forget about them. And then they kind of show this example of how this would work in a class. And so here to show this example of the use effect again, it's saying by using this hook, you're telling React that your component needs to do something after it renders. So that's really what this idea of a side effect means. Is it's like after it renders, I want to do this. I want to do this thing. And so after it renders the first time, the state is set, right? It's set to 0 and then it counts. But every time we call set count, the component updates. And when the component updates, well, the state updates. And when the state updates, the component has new data. And so using the use effect hook means that every time after the component's data gets set again, we're going to enter into this kind of use effect hook. So you can see that think of it like a method that gets called whenever something is changing within the component. So a good way to kind of see this is if we add a console log into this and say like inside use effect. And again, remember that the point of the hook is so that you can just do some of this stuff from inside of a functional component, right? All of this stuff is built into a class component. You could do all of these things very easily within a class. But if you wanted to do this stuff within a functional component, right, it wasn't as simple. So after the render, so clearly we've rendered the first time, we're inside the use effect. I click once, we're inside of the use effect again. I click another time, click a bunch of times, and clearly we're inside the use effect each time after we've clicked this button, right? So if you want to have almost like a callback function after your component has rendered or after something has triggered the component, like this said, to either update or leave the hierarchy, that is the hook that you have to use to make that happen. Yeah, the use effect hook is important because you can use it to do a couple things. Like one is to respond to changes, clearly like we're seeing here, but then two is like after your component's rendered, this would be where you can set some follow-up code to then do something external. So like say for instance, you wanted to, after the component loads, I want to get information about the user that I can send to a server and validate. Maybe it's like a login thing and you're trying to validate with the server whether the user logged in or not. And the use effect hook would be the place where you can write that code and the function that will get called back after you've changed something within the state for the for that user or whatnot as well. So yeah, it runs after every render. It is it allows you to make access of all of the props or state variables that are passed into the into your functional component. And just remember that it gets called to tell your component needs to do something after it renders. And so now they're just kind of explaining that a little bit more. There's another example of use effects with effects that use cleanup. So this is a little bit more interesting in that sometimes you might want something to perform some function after something, like basically the cleanup function is like creating another opportunity for your hook to run and finish after something's done, after a process is finished, to run some extra code that is necessary at that point. So that happens a lot when you want to remove connections to like a subscription that you might create. Like so if you're creating like a socket or like a server connection that you don't want to have reestablished every time that a component is being created, you might want to remove that connection before the component goes away. And so that's exactly like this kind of example they're showing here. Is like, let's assume we have this chat API module that lets us subscribe to a friend's online status. And so we might subscribe to that this way by way of, so they're showing this in the class. In the component didn't mount, you just subscribe to your friend status. But then when the component is leaving, you'd want to unsubscribe because you don't want to stay subscribed to that status after this component goes away. So in the hook-based sense, you can use the use effect hook to then create to like set it up where you can subscribe. But then the use effect hook has this optional function that you can return that's called cleanup. And the cleanup function basically runs after the use effect hook runs, and it says what to do after that particular this particular use effect stuff has ran. And in this example, they're unsubscribing from this function. And remember that this use effect hook will run, and then it'll get called. This cleanup function gets called almost like immediately afterward. So let's see if we add this to our use effect hook and just kind of put a console log. And let's just go to our little app. Cool. So after each time the use effect hook is being created, you can see that the use effect cleanup is run. So, and it's only really run each time the component itself is updating and something's being taken away. So this function is useful for running code inside of the use effect after the use effect has run, and you're like, oh, I want to like clean up the stuff that happens after the function. You don't necessarily need it. It's optional. It's an optional cleanup function. And it performs the cleanup when the component unmounts. So yeah, it's this one hook is responsible for like 3 big lifecycle methods inside of the component. And it's important to understand that you use the use effect hook to just respond to things that are happening outside of the render function for your component. So if you wanted something to update after the component was rendered the first time and it's not in your functional component, chances are you have to use the use effect hook to tell that component to update after it's rendered. And if you want to tell the component to do something before that component goes away, you also would use the use effect hook in the cleanup function to define what that component should do when it's supposed to go away. And so, yeah, the use state and the use effect hooks are the 2 most important hooks. And you end up using them all the time if you start using hooks and use React components and hooks in that sense. There's a couple rules for how you're supposed to leverage hooks. So you're not supposed to call hooks inside of loops and conditionals or nested functions. You always keep your hooks at the top level of your React function, and you make it so that you can only call hooks from your React functions themselves. Don't call them from regular JavaScript functions. It says just call them from functional components and that stuff. You can also create custom hooks, and that's something that a lot of people end up doing in these packages, which is why I was telling you that it's important to just kind of understand the syntax of hooks. But you can build your own hooks, and basically that allows you to extract logic into for your components into these reusable functions in and of itself. The use effect hook here was like doing a lot of really interesting things in this example with this chat API. So they were showing you how you could create like your own set of hooks based on some of what you want to return. And the process of creating a custom hook is not as complicated as you might think it is based on what it sounds like. You kind of just have the hook defined, and then you return some functions from that particular in that particular hook. And then you can use the hook itself. You can use the hook itself like a regular function, kind of like you see here. And yeah, so people have created like their own hooks to be used in functional components. And so that's why I wanted y'all to just be aware of like this syntax. And typically something that says use something is typically a hook. And so, and normally a custom hook that somebody created. And so I just wanted to point that out as y'all start looking at packages and leveraging code and looking at examples, and you see people using this, but you might not have been familiar with it. But yeah, the two most important ones that you got to familiarize yourself with from React are the use state and the use effect hook. Other custom hooks will be defined by people who have created them, and they'll give you some documentation as to how you're supposed to use that particular hook in your own code base. But then again, you can also create your own hooks inside of your React apps yourself. So yeah, as it says here, a custom hook is a JavaScript function whose name starts with use and that may call other hooks. And so the reason I had brought this up was because remember inside of that React router project we were doing just earlier, there was a function called use navigate or like or something like that, right? And I was like, oh, use navigate, huh? Like must be a hook, right? And so that's why I wanted to kind of bring this up, because I had saw that and I was like, yeah, probably should just tell you all about hooks a little bit so you're aware of how it works. But yeah, this is an example of this hook, use friend status, that returns whether or not someone is online. And the whole hook itself returns the value, right, is online. And then the use effect for it, this hook itself is using other hooks, and it's using the use state hook to create this online data that then gets passed back to the other component. But then the use effect hook, it's using this use effect hook to actually kind of set up the friend connection to that friend status and whatnot, and changing whether or not the status is online or not. So now instead of having to put all this code in your particular components whenever you wanted to use a friend status, you could just use this one hook that will tell you whether they're online or not based on their friend ID. And so, you know, you could use hooks to save yourself a little bit of code and do some really interesting logic with state and props that get returned into other components very easily. I've seen a lot of people use this kind of syntax for like authentication. So they'll create an authentication hook. So the hook will see something whether like a user is signed in or not, and have like clearly like a use effect to handle whether or not that user is still logged in. and then just pass whether they're logged in or not around to other components that can just pull the hook in and then use it. And that's just, it's really that simple, right? So yeah, I hope that y'all found this kind of introduction to hooks helpful. You'll probably start seeing them used all over the place now that you see this. So I definitely recommend reading through the hooks guide in the React docs and yeah, getting familiar with it on your own. It's a pretty important aspect of working with functional components. Again, it's not it doesn't take away from the main component concepts we've talked about. All of those same concepts are structured into class-based components with these bolded methods that you see here: constructors, renders, component did mount, component did update, component will unmount. So all the things that you see people doing with hooks, you can realistically do with a class. Hooks just give you that added benefit of leveraging functional components and creating these custom little functional components and functions that return some very important state related data in an easy to pass around format. Yeah, so that's that, and I appreciate y'all for sticking with me. And